Rob Caskie, proudly engaging in storytelling. And it's interesting to note that amongst my colleagues and friends who are battlefield guides, there tends to be a bias towards the Anglo-Boer War or the Anglo-Zulu War. But it's very difficult really to separate the two in terms of a colonial military interest. And in fact, most of the guides who guide on these battlefields end up during the course of their lives and their guiding careers, guiding on both the Anglo-Boer and the Anglo-Zulu War battlefield sites. I've chosen to live in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands, which indeed is not far from much of the early voortrekker history in these parts of Natal, as it was then Natalia. It's not far from the famous Tugela River, the Tugela line, that featured so prominently in the opening phases of the Anglo-Boer War. And indeed, it's within striking distance of the Anglo-Zulu War sites, which I choose to specialize in. And some of the background to the first Transvaal War of Independence really is intriguing, and it needs to be looked at in some detail. I often maintain to our visitors that sometimes the stories of the battle are indeed less interesting than the stories of the background and the history leading up to these famous battles. So the Dutch people, who became known as the Boers, Afrikaans word for farmer, or the Afrikaner people, came out to South Africa in waves all the way back, dating to 1652 and the time of the Dutch East India Company. Many folk think that they were exclusively Dutch. They were not. There were a lot of Belgians, French, Portuguese, and others amongst them who came out from Europe largely on account of religious persecution and the Edict of Nantes, looking for a better life, better climate, more space here in South Africa, and began to settle down at that southwestern point around the mother city of Cape Town, and then began a farm inland. Thank heavens for the French with their viticulture and their knowledge of vineyards and growing and production of good wines. And as the numbers increased, more and more of them, many of them rebellious against administration, rebellious against any sort of rules, and most importantly, rebellious against tax, began to move inland and began to find themselves a little place to eke out an existence with their slaves, their families, their livestock, and farming in this huge part of South Africa that we know as the Cape Province. And then in 1815, a very, very unusual event took place where a Hottentot slave was badly treated by a farmer not very far from Craddock at a place called Slagter's Neck. The situation escalated considerably, and Cape colonial policemen arrived to arrest the said farmer. Well, in the fracas that developed, one of the Cape colonial policemen was shot. The ringleaders of this rebellion, for want of a better word, were sentenced to death for treason. There were 5 of them. And when the 5 were hung up publicly, the ropes on 4 of the 5 men at this public hanging snapped. The Boers tend to be deeply religious people, and they said that this was definitely an act of God, and that the men who'd been spared the hanging should immediately be released. But the local magistrate insisted that more rope be obtained, and those 4 men were strung up until dead. Well, this incident, Slagter's Neck in 1815, created the spark, really, that fired Afrikaner nationalism in South Africa, and indeed created a major rift, if there was not one already, between the Afrikaners and the British authorities in the Cape. And then in 1834, Benjamin de Urban promulgated legislation for the emancipation of slaves. All slave owners had to release their slaves, but were promised compensation. The compensation, however, had to be recovered in person in London. Now, for most of these folks farming in distant parts of the Cape, the idea of collecting compensation in person in London was absolutely ridiculous, and they thought this legislation was a deliberate attempt to irritate them, which of course it did. And they packed up their belongings, their families, their erstwhile slaves, and their livestock, and they began to move off into the hinterland of South Africa in what became known as the Great Trek, the Great Movement. And some of those trekkers as they are well known. Some of those Boers, under the leadership of Piet Retief, ended up negotiating for land with the Zulu king Dingaan here in the province of Natal. I have gone through the background to the story in some detail in an earlier story. Well, Piet Retief and his followers were murdered by Dingaan, and Andries Pretorius came up from the Cape to lead retaliation against the Zulus, which indeed led to the Battle of Blood River on the 16th of December of 1838, perhaps one of the most pivotal battles in South African history. For a week leading up to that battle, the Boers had prayed to God for victory over these black people. And if they were delivered a victory, they would keep the day holy for the rest of time and build a church in his honor in their capital, Pietermaritzburg. Well, in the battle, not a single Boer lost his life. They killed, we believe, legend has it, around 3,000 Zulus until the waters of the Nome River ran red with blood, hence the name of that battle. And it gave these Afrikaner people the clear impression that they were the chosen people in the promised land. It gave them the impression that they were the chosen ones, the masters, and that they were going to dominate and indeed exist in this country as they saw fit. Well, the situation bumbled along for some time until the discovery of diamonds in 1867 at Hopetown. The border of the Cape Colony was moved to include the diamond fields of Kimberley and those mighty kimberlite pipes of diamonds, and the Orange Free State were spared the issues of a burgeoning mining town within their territory, but given an insatiable demand for everything they could produce just across the border, which swelled the coffers of the Orange Free State considerably. Well, isn't it interesting to note that with these two white tribes, the Afrikaans, or the Dutch, and the British in South Africa, the British effectively having control over the Cape and Natal, but looking more and more at the areas of the Free State and the Transvaal. In 1877, Theophilus Shepstone, the Secretary of Colonial Affairs here in Natal, would annex the Transvaal. He simply rode to Pretoria on horseback with a very small posse of men. They marched down Church Street and pinned a proclamation onto the door of President Burgers saying that the Transvaal had been annexed to the British Empire. The British in the Transvaal were delighted. The Afrikaans, the Boers, were horrified. The Vice President of the Transvaal at the time was a man called Paul Kruger, who features very prominently in these stories. At 12 years of age, he was reloading the old muskets in that lager at Gagkop near the Vaal River, fighting off the mighty Matabele. At 21, he was a man who had half his thumb blown off when his blunderbuss misfired on a hunting trip. And with gangrene setting in, he took a hunting knife, heated the blade, and cut off the remains of his own thumb. Brave man, and a man who in his youth was known for his incredible, legendary physical strength, his drooping jowls, and his rheumy eyes. A man who claimed that all his life the only book he'd ever read was the Bible, which he'd read a number of times from beginning to end. Well, Paul Kruger went to London, objecting strongly to the annexation of the Transvaal. He was unsuccessful. The authorities in the Transvaal and many back in Britain maintained that the annexation was indeed advantageous for the greater portion of the population in the Transvaal, and the annexation remained in place. Well, try to imagine only 2 years later in 1879, when the British Army declared war on the Zulu people here in Natal, and one of the opening battles was at a place called Isandlwana, where the Zulus overwhelmed the British Central Column and left 1,329 British soldiers dead. Imagine the Boers sitting on the recesses of the Transvaal, looking down on this battle, awaiting the outcome between their two mortal enemies. And the outcome suited them beautifully. Were we not able to defeat these self-same Zulus armed the same way at Blood River 41 years earlier, we can defeat the British and boot them out of the Transvaal. And the grumblings began to manifest themselves. Well, there's always a little spark that lands in the powder keg, so to speak. And the spark for the beginning of the first Transvaal War of Independence proved to be over tax for a farmer called besieged near the town of Potchefstroom in the Western Transvaal. And besieged's wagon was confiscated by the sheriff. Well, a wagon is incredibly important to Boer people and to Boer families. And it's interesting to note that that wagon was recovered by Boers who pushed the hapless sheriff aside and recovered besieged's wagon. But there was now an imminently aggressive and hostile environment developing between the British and the Boers in the Transvaal. The Transvaal garrisons decided to reinforce their garrison, for example, in Pretoria, and they sent a man called Lieutenant Colonel Anstruther to march from Lydenburg to reinforce the garrison in Pretoria. And he had to march along a road that goes through the Bronkhorst-Spruit koppies. Following the Bronkhorst-Spruit, this is a little stream that crosses the road, crosses the stream a number of times through the koppies. Well, as they entered those koppies, a Boer arrived with a letter telling Anstruther to return to his peacetime garrison at Lydenburg. And he probably responded as many senior British officers would have been told to march to Pretoria, and that's what I intend to do. He had taken the precaution of issuing his men live ammunition, and as they considered the next move, many of his soldiers had jumped over a fence into a nearby peach orchard belonging to an unfortunate farmer by the name of Honey. Well, when the break was over, Anstruther decided that he was going to proceed on his march to Pretoria. Marching to Pretoria has taken on a special connotation in this country. We even have a song about marching to Pretoria. And as they took up the march, they were fired upon by Boers on both sides of the pass in the koppies. It was a dreadful defeat for the British. 77 left dead, amongst them a woman and a child who had somehow got caught up in this catastrophe. The men were told that the ones who were well enough were going to be returning to Lydenburg. The prisoners of war were going to be sent under armed guard to Kruger and Heidelberg, which was the Boer capital at the time. And isn't it intriguing to consider that those British soldiers who were buried, many still had peaches in the pockets of their uniform, and as a result, the graveyard where these men were buried would in due course produce wonderful peach trees taken from Mr. Honey's peach orchard. Well, the garrisons in the Transvaal were immediately besieged, and reinforcements were sent up out of Natal to try and relieve the sieges of these garrisons. Well, Commandant Piet Joubert, who was one of the senior Boer commanders at the time, would await the British forces at the top of Laing's Neck Pass on the Natal-Transvaal border between the towns of Newcastle and Volksrust. Well, the first action that took place, the British chargers on their horses were destined to gallop up a long, graceful slope up towards the Boer positions. The horses and the men were soon winded, and then the Boers opened fire upon them. Many lives were lost on the British side. At the Battle of Laing's Neck, the British had to withdraw and plan their next action. The Boers, in the meantime, cut the line of communication behind them, and when the British tried to reinstall their lines of communication, they were attacked and defeated at a place called Ingogo. The Boers call it Skeinshoogte. And then Colley, before the reinforcements arrived, decided that he was going to take a hill called Majuba, the Hill of Doves. And on the 26th of February of 1881, having been told that the Boers don't maintain the summit during the night, but preferred to return to the comforts of their lagers down beneath the mountain, they would ascend the mountain in the dark. A man who emerges very prominently in both of these wars, called Ian Hamilton of the Gordon Highlanders, said to Colley, "Shouldn't we build barricades and protective arrangements around the summit of the hill?" And Colley said, "Oh no, the men need to rest now for the action that's going to come in the morning." Now, these mountains here in this part of the world, created by erosion over the eons of time, have slopes that indeed are shaped in a convex manner, that when you are ascending those slopes, if you're on the summit of the hill, for much of it, you cannot see the men ascending the mountain. And indeed, for the British on the top, they saw the Boers come partially up the slope of Majuba, leave their horses in the care of younger men, and then began a climb on foot up the steep slopes of Majuba. Well, when they finally summited Majuba, it was not the British who led a charge, but rather the Boers. Colley was shot, dead. It was a great calamity for the British. Indeed, Hamilton was shot through the wrist. A kind Boer was able to bind up his wrist and try and stop the bleeding. And as Hamilton and the others withdrew down the back of Majuba, Hamilton would indeed stumble off the path and faint. He awoke with a dog licking his face. It was his beloved terrier Patch, who had been alarmed when he hadn't returned with the other British soldiers and had picked up his scent and gone out to look for him. And there was Patch licking Hamilton's face, and Hamilton was able to return safely to the camp at O'Neill's cottage. Well, his wrist and hand never recovered, remained pretty much as a painful scar for the rest of his life. And with the defeats at Bronkhorstspruit, at Laing's Neck, at Ingogo Skenshoogte, and then indeed at Majuba, with 4 defeats in a row, the British impressed upon the British authorities here to give the Boers their peace. And indeed, with these 4 bloody noses that the British had received, the Boers in the Transvaal and indeed the Free State were given back their independence. What is wonderful to consider is that there was a march in Pretoria, 600 men involved, where they burnt an effigy of the British Prime Minister Gladstone, and they took down the Union flag that had been raised in 1877 at the time of the annexation, and only 4 years later they would lower it. They folded it up and placed it in a coffin and marched it out of Pretoria along Church Street, and it was buried. And the headstone reads, "In other climes, to know thee was to love thee. Rise again." So the antagonism and the attitude here in South Africa was beginning to boil between the Afrikaners, the Boers, and the British. And this, of course, would be accentuated in the most unprecedented manner only 5 years later with the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand by a British citizen called George Harrison in 1886. More about that shortly. Thank you very much.